Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, do you have any special phrases or utterances that you hold close to your heart in times of trouble?
How do you mean?
When I'm facing times of hardship, I utter something to myself, either out loud or in my mind, such as keep calm and carry on, or something like that. It helps me remember to be calm and to persevere.
I see what you mean. I often like to think to myself, this too shall pass, or something of that nature when times are tough. Sometimes I do it so often that the words themselves lose their meaning, and the sound of my inner voice saying those things alone reminds me of what they mean to me.
The Buddha undoubtedly emphasizes the importance of the sound of such phrases. It is the sound that is on one level delightful, calming, and triggers mindfulness. Then the meaning is another layer of benefit and efficacy in the phrase.
What do you think is a good Buddhist phrase to speak to ourselves to remind us of the teaching?
Maybe just something as simple as praise be to the Shakyamuni Buddha.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing mantra. What is the meaning of the word mantra? What are the different understandings of the word in Buddhism, as well as outside of it? And what are some of the most famous mantras and their function? So let's get to it. What is the meaning of the word mantra?
I think it's important to discuss both the colloquial meaning and the actual doctrinal Buddhist meaning. The colloquial meaning of the word is that it is a frequently uttered and repeated phrase or slogan. Examples include everything happens for a reason, what goes around comes around, the only way out is through, etc. These phrases have a number of functions. First, they remind us of something that we need in order to get through some sort of situation that's in front of us. They empower and aid us through grief, hardship, or any other adversity by reminding us of some sort of perseverance or strength that we have inside of us. Additionally, they can serve as invocations, which we hope will change some circumstances which we're experiencing. For example, a mantra that is religious, like through God all things are possible, is in part meant to invoke the presence of God, to watch over the situation, or to empower the speaker with God's power in some way. To that end, mantras are empowering, evocative, and spiritually efficacious phrases that we utter for specific purposes. We need to discuss these meanings here because they are not actually all that far off in some ways from the Buddhist definitions of the word mantra. In Buddhism, a mantra is a phrase that is preserved, copied, recited, chanted, or written for a specific purpose. There are some important characteristics that we should mention here. First, the important component of mantras is not their meaning or the content of the phrase. It is actually the sound that they make. And when they're spoken, that's what matters the most. To that end, throughout East Asia, they will often be preserved in Sanskrit or Pali and recited in those languages, even in China, Korea, and Japan. This means that they'll often be transliterated. Transliteration means that you'll start with one language and you'll take the words of that language and use your own syllable system of your mother language to express those sounds. The second important characteristic of them is that they invoke good merit, they invoke mindfulness, they banish negative characters like demons or hungry ghosts, or they purify bad karma or those bad characters themselves. That means that their recitation has a clear and obvious spiritual function that is similar to the colloquial understanding of a spell. In fact, whenever my own professor was living in Japan, there was somebody in his neighborhood who went door to door, and they were offering to recite the Heart Sutra to banish hungry ghosts from the space and to bless the space, as it were. We should remember that in East Asian Buddhism, recitation and copying of the sutras is very important because of reasons quite similar to these. They aid in meditation, and they invoke the teaching, and they bestow good merit and wholesome mind states on the speaker and the hearer. Most importantly, they also purify bad karma. The main difference is that when reciting the sutras, the meaning is equally as important as the sound. So they're recited in translation instead of in transliteration. That means that if we start with texts in Sanskrit or Pali, we will recite them in Chinese if we're in China, or in English if we are in America or the West. as opposed to trying to say those words in the original language using our own syllable system.
What are the different understandings of the word mantra in Buddhism?
In esoteric Buddhism, also known as Vajrayana Buddhism, mantra are one of 3 practices whose purpose is to break down the distinction between the practitioner and the Buddha himself. The emphasis of the teaching is that whosoever does mantra, which are uttered phrases, mudra, which are body poses, and mandala, which are sacred images, becomes the Buddha in that practice. Mantra are the words of the Buddha, and so to speak them is to become the Buddha speaking those words. This theme is developed across a lot of different practices of Vajrayana Buddhism. For example, mudra are done while sitting in meditation, and some common ones include keeping your hands in your lap with the palms upward, with the fingers of one hand inside the other hand, and keeping your thumb tips touching. Oftentimes you'll find Buddhist statuary in this pose. Another common one is laying your right hand across your lap with the palm up and touching the tip of your middle finger of your right hand to the ground. These poses are poses the Buddha did in meditation and in teaching and in other activities, and so they're done by the practitioners to mirror that activity, to mirror that experience of the Buddha. Additionally, mandala used to be thought of as meditation aids alone. These sacred images, which represent a particular space, like a Pure Land or samsara or Tushita heaven, used to be thought of simply as our own map or our own imagination of these spaces. However, the act of creating one and observing one, though it is used as an exercise in mindfulness, is now being thought of to simply be an actual creation of and residence in the space they're meant to represent. To clarify, when creating a mandala of, for example, Amida Buddha's Pure Land, the creator is not drawing a picture or a map. He's not imagining the Pure Land for himself or for others. Rather, he or she is actually creating that Pure Land in this world. Mantra are exactly the same way. When we recite the sutras, we are quoting the words of the Buddha, and the goal is to become the Buddha speaking those words. When we recite mantra, some Buddhists believe we achieve that goal and become the Buddha speaking those words. And the Buddha has the power to purify bad karma, to banish evil spirits, to invoke mindfulness or trigger mindfulness on command like that. So, just as mandala creates the world that it represents in this world, mantra invokes the teaching and brings about the Buddha preaching the Dharma in this world.
So when I'm seeing statuary with very specific poses like that, then what I'm seeing is a depiction of a mudra?
Exactly. Mudra is also inherited from Brahmanical traditions as well. And so there's plenty of mudra for meditation purposes in Hinduism also. Those have a different meaning and association and function that we won't get into right now. But each of these mudras in statuary means something specific. For example, I have a statue on my desk right in front of me where the medicine Buddha, Akshobhya, has his right hand up, palm facing out, and his left hand covering the palm of his right hand facing in. This is a shielding posture and has to do with protection and the Dharma's ability to protect us from delusion, from evil spirits, from falling into hell, etc. There's lots of these types of mudra, and oftentimes some of them will be associated with specific Buddhas. For example, the mudra that I mentioned before, where both palms are up and the tips of the thumb are touching, that's often the pose that you'll see Amida Buddha in Japanese statuary. There's a lot of famous statuary out there that has this pose, and you can clearly identify it as being Amida in that way. Oftentimes, you have to identify statuary in this way by either their pose, their costume, or whatever object they're holding.
I'll also add, just as a note to the listener, if you want to actually go and see some of this stuff, just Google Vajrayana mandala. You get a lot of pictures, and they're really cool. I'm looking at some mandalas right now. I really like the way these look.
They're really fun to look at, and they're really fun to study and observe. And there's all different kinds of them. They used to be thought of as being universal. There was a simple way of creating them where your goal as the creator of the mandala was to create the entire universe in that image. But then it got more specific. Create a Pure Land, create the realm of humans, create the Tushita heaven, for example, specific places in the world, create Vulture Peak where the Buddha is preaching. And the purpose of that is to put the practitioner in that space, in that specific space. If you draw yourself into a mandala listening to the Buddha preaching at Vulture Peak, then you are doing so. Similarly, if you recite mantra as though you are the Buddha preaching on Vulture Peak, suddenly you are the Buddha preaching on Vulture Peak. And that is the non-dualistic and the non-distinction aspect that mantra carry with them, at least in esoteric Buddhism. To that end, they're not used prescriptively as a spell or incantation to do away with evil spirits, as they might be in East Asian Buddhism, in, for example, Pure Land Buddhism, or in Zen, or in other traditions. But in this esoteric tradition, they are meant to be aids of meditation practice, and they are meant to make the person the Buddha right here, right now.
So that was a bit of a sidetrack, but mudras and mandalas are cool enough to merit a sidetrack, I think. But let's get back to mantras. So, what are some of the most famous mantras and their function?
The one that no doubt most people who have heard of Buddhism are familiar with is Om Mani Padme Hum. The function of this one is one of giving and receiving universal compassion and loving kindness. It has a relationship with the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who, as we've talked about before, whose domain is this sort of nurturing and compassion and rescuing people who are suffering. If we were to unpack and parse out every piece of this mantra, which I should remind you we're not supposed to do because it's not part of the practice, but it does help unpack the meaning, then we would say Om is the sacred syllable, the original syllable of reality from which all other syllables arise. In Chinese and Japanese, it's transliterated, but mind you, not translated, as Am or Ah. In esoteric Buddhism, this sound represents the original sound, the original fundamental vibration of reality that creates all the different vibrations that result in the differentiation of things. So in that teaching, at the center of everything is the sound Ah or Om. Mani Padme is, some think, an epithet of Avalokiteshvara, or maybe a female deity named Mani Padme. It's difficult to know. There's a lot of trouble with translating Sanskrit. It's very complicated. So it's difficult to know, especially in the absence of other texts, what these specific words are referring to, especially whenever they each mean so many different things. Hum, we think, represents wisdom, the wisdom that we have to strive for enlightenment. The words altogether serve as an invocation or an incantation, and so it's extremely difficult to translate them into other languages. Other common ones that come out of East Asian Mahayana Buddhism include the Nyanfo or the Nenbutsu. Out of those two, the Nyanfo is Chinese and the Nenbutsu is Japanese. These are both the same phrase, but in different languages. The Chinese version is Namu Ami Tuafo, and the Japanese version is Namu Amida Butsu. This phrase means something like, praise be to the Amida Buddha, or I pledge devotion to the Amida Buddha. The difficult part of that one is actually Namu. That can mean praise be to, or I pledge allegiance or devotion to, or respect upon, whatever. And the second part is just the name of Amida Buddha. This phrase is commonly recited by Pure Land Buddhists as an expression of faith in Amida Buddha, whose Pure Land many Buddhists want to be born in their next life. Finally, a common mantra that you'll hear in Japan is Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. This phrase is the same as the previous one, but instead of praising or devoting to Amida Buddha, it praises the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. Followers of Nichiren Buddhism utter this phrase to express their faith in their prophesied Buddhahood, but also utter it as an expression of the central essence or the central teaching of the Lotus Sutra. This is a controversial and non-trivial thing to say. The Lotus Sutra, being 300 pages long, plus, has way too many different teachings for you to just clearly be able to say there is one central essence to it all. And Nichiren, the founder of Nichiren Buddhism, had to take a stance on that. And the reason why that's important is that whenever you recite this phrase, what you are invoking, what you are pledging your devotion to, is what Nichiren said the central teaching of the Lotus Sutra is. That central teaching to him is universal Buddhahood. All beings, no matter what, are destined for future Buddhahood. This is captured by the part of the phrase myoho. That translates roughly to wondrous dharma, or mysterious dharma, or subtle dharma. And that refers directly to something that you might find in between the lines of the Lotus Sutra. It's an interpretive reading of the Lotus Sutra, which Nichiren did and which followers of Nichiren Buddhism do. There are many more mantra that I have no doubt will come up in future episodes, but these have been just a few of the most popular ones that I have encountered in my studies.
I suspect this is going to have to wait to another episode because it's quite a sidetrack, but I'm very interested in this idea of as the original sacred syllable. I want to know more about what that means and how this was codified, how it was discovered, how it was created, whatever the correct way to... I want to dig into the origin of that idea.
I think that's a good one too, because not only is it the first syllable of Sanskrit alphabet, right, but it also reflects the fact that in order for any human being to utter a phrase, you have to make the sound somehow. That's the sound of someone buzzing their vocal cords without doing anything with their mouth, is or om. So in doing so, in making that the sacred and original syllable of the universe, they are emphasizing and prioritizing speech, specifically speech. And I think that's related to this mantra discussion. They're prioritizing speech as the singular and monistic entity or singularity from which things are differentiated. In that regard, in this understanding, all of the universe and reality, as we've talked about before, constitutes words, constitutes letters and sentences and words that are the Dharma that are being preached by something or somebody. And in that regard, to utter Om as part of a mantra is to connect to and plug into that universal singular monistic thing and get something out of it, get some sort of this worldly benefit out of it, come to some greater understanding of reality. And so in that regard, even though mantra can sometimes be spells, incantations, magic words, you might say, they can also be aids in meditation. They can be aids in concentration. They can be things that you say to yourself as fuel, as encouragement for continuing to come to a greater understanding of reality. And it's interesting because prayer in other religions doesn't have the same function. Prayer doesn't cause this sort of wisdom. It doesn't cause this sort of anything. It causes a connection to be forged between the person praying and whoever they are praying to. And in this regard, mantra are not the same way. Mantra do not necessarily forge a connection to some external and intangible deity. They actually forge a non-dual connection. They transform you into something or someone else. Or they invoke a teaching for some sort of magical purpose. And I think that that's one of the more interesting functions of mantra.
We hope you have enjoyed our discussion of mantra in Buddhism. Join us next week where we discuss past lives and reincarnation in Buddhism. What does the canon say about people who claim to remember their past lives or part of them? How does one come to remember past lives? What does Buddhism say about groups of people whose karma is so intertwined that they continue to find each other across multiple reincarnations? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. Tweet us at brightbuddhism. And join us on our Discord server, The Hidden Sangha, link in description. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much.